Hey guys, tonight we step into the damp, stone corridors of a medieval monastery, where soft candlelight flickers against time-worn walls, and the only sounds are the gentle rhythm of rainfall and the distant chant of evening prayers echoing through the cloisters. Outside, the world is loud, hurried, full of sharp corners and deadlines. But here, things move differently. You feel the cold flagstones underfoot, the earthy scent of damp parchment, beeswax, and believe it or not, fermenting barley. Because yes, among their many spiritual pursuits, monks were also quietly perfecting the art of brewing beer. And not just any beer. This was the deeply devotional, meticulously timed, monk-approved kind of ale, brewed not out of indulgence, but because, well, water wasn't always the safest option, and someone had to keep the vow of hydration. Still, as you walk past that sleepy monk snoring beside a sack of grain, you start to wonder how exactly did these silent, robe-clad souls turn hops and holiness into one of history's most enduring beverages. Let's be honest, you probably wouldn't last a week in a monastery. Cold beds, 2 a.m., wake-up bells, and more silence than your last group chat. But it's nice to pretend, especially with the sound of rain outside and no urgent anything waiting for you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and local time. I love knowing where in the world you're relaxing tonight. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle slowly along a narrow hallway. The windows are small, meant less for the view and more for the soft light they admit. One of them opens slightly. The rain patters gently against the ledge. A bird chirps once, then thinks better of it and falls silent. The monastery feels outside of time, suspended between stone and ritual. A bell sounds, distant and mellow, not the kind that calls armies, but the kind that calls you to vespers, or maybe to tea if monks had tea. In this case, they probably had beer, and you're about to discover just how central that humble drink was to the rhythm of monastic life. Behind a thick wooden door, someone's muttering Latin. It's not a prayer, it's a tally. Something about barrels and barley. You peek in, and there he is, Brother Anselm, the cellarer, carefully measuring a sack of malt with the same reverence one might apply to holy relics. He doesn't notice you, or maybe he does, and chooses not to disturb the silence. Either way, you're now standing in one of the oldest breweries in Europe. There's no hiss of carbonation, no stainless steel tanks, just wooden tubs, steam rising from warm mash, and the smell sweet, nutty, with a sour edge. Not unpleasant, just honest, grounded. Historians still argue whether the monks fully understood fermentation or if they simply chalked it up to divine intervention. You can almost imagine one of them staring into a bubbling vat, whispering, "The Lord works in mysterious yeasts," and perhaps he did, outside the brewery. Another monk sweeps the cloister. Rain dots the edges of his robe, and he pauses to inspect a puddle as if it might contain divine insight. It doesn't. Just a worm and a few fallen leaves. Still, he smiles. Every step here feels intentional, nothing wasted. You imagine living this way rising before dawn, praying in rhythm with the seasons, and measuring out your beer allowance like a sacrament. Because, oh yes, there was an allowance. Depending on the order and the era, monks could consume up to a gallon of beer a day, not all at once. Mind you, spread throughout the day, like sips of spiritual encouragement, or hydration, or both. Back in the brewing room, Brother Anselm stirs the mash, slowly, clockwise. There's probably a reason for that, though he'd never say. The room is warm, almost cozy. If you ignore the damp stone and the occasional mouse darting underfoot, you step closer to the steam and feel your face flush a little. It smells better now, fuller, like something's coming to life. The monks didn't just make beer for themselves. They offered it to pilgrims, travelers, sometimes even nobles who came sniffing around for free samples. It was part hospitality, part fundraising, and part, well, let's call it divine marketing. You trail your fingers along a row of wooden mugs hanging on pegs. Each one is slightly different. Some are carved, some chipped, all used. This isn't mass production. It's quiet, devotional brewing. And every pint had to balance the vow of poverty with the need to not serve garbage. Some monasteries became so good at brewing that nearby townspeople preferred monk beer to the local stuff. The irony, of course, is that monks weren't supposed to care about worldly success. But if God wanted your abbey's ale to become a local favorite, who were you to argue? In one corner, a cat yawns on a sack of dried hops. You don't pet him, he's clearly in the middle of a sacred nap. The rain hasn't stopped. It rarely does in places like this. But instead of dreary, it feels restful, cleansing, like each drop is meant to lull you deeper into this quiet world of ritual and barley. You sit for a moment on a low stool. The stone beneath you hums with centuries of footsteps, prayers, and the faintest scent of old smoke. Somewhere, a hymn rises distant, barely audible, but just enough to thread itself into the falling rain. You close your eyes for a second, just a second, and then a soft clink of wooden ladle against barrel stirs you again. Brother Anselm is now pouring a small sample into a clay cup. He sniffs it, sips, nods. It's not for him, it's for the prior, or maybe for the pilgrims who will arrive tomorrow, cloaks soaked and eyes weary, searching for a warm fire and something to ease the cold. You stand again and continue through the corridor, deeper into the abbey. The brewing might be sacred, but it's only one part of a much larger rhythm, one you're only beginning to hear. You follow the soft shuffle of your own feet as they echo along the cloister walkway, the sound hushed by rain and old stone. The rhythm here is sacred, not just prayer and study, but structure, form, a life measured out in bells and bowls and barrels. And one name hovers over all this gentle order, Saint Benedict. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, wasn't just a moral guide. It was more like a lifestyle handbook, a monastic IKEA manual, complete with instructions for when to pray, when to eat, when to keep silent, and lucky you when to drink beer. You duck into a small library where shelves sag under the weight of centuries. There's no one here but a few open scrolls and a faint smell of tallow and leather. You pull one manuscript off the shelf carefully, reverently, and ease it open. The letters are precise, looped, slightly faded. Latin, of course, always Latin. But there it is, vinum non satis utile monaches. Wine is not suitable for monks. And yet, somehow, beer didn't make the list. Historians still argue whether Saint Benedict was completely against alcohol or just against too much of it. Probably the latter. The rule advised moderation, and what counted as moderate seemed to shift depending on the weather, the location, and possibly the thickness of your habit. You close the manuscript gently and continue walking. Rain is still murmuring outside. It's beginning to feel like background music, a little percussion to your slowly unspooling thoughts. The thing about the rule is that it wasn't just about spiritual discipline. It shaped every part of the monk's day. From rising before dawn, often called matins, which sounds like something you'd order at a health cafe, to the evening complaint. Monks lived their lives by scheduled acts of prayer and work. Ora et labora, pray and labor. And labor wasn't just gardening or copying texts. Brewing counted too. In fact, it was encouraged especially when it served the greater good. And let's face it, clean water was risky business. The fermentation process in beer boiling, alcohol content, hops meant it was often safer to drink than water from the nearest stream. So monks brewed not to party, but to live, to nourish, to stay hydrated without violating their vow of moderation. It was practical and kind of genius. You step into the cloister garden, where rain gently spatters leaves and earth. The monks grew herbs here, not just for medicine, but for beer. Mugwort, yarrow, sage before hops took over. These herbs flavored early brews. Some of them even helped with digestion. Others were, well, maybe just there for fun. One text suggests a sleepy little brew with lavender and rosemary, meant to soothe the soul and knock out a headache, or a restless pilgrim. You pass a young monk tending the garden. He nods but doesn't speak. Speech is restricted outside of necessary words, and even then, it's usually done through a surprisingly sophisticated system of hand signals. Imagine trying to mime I added too much barley without causing a theological crisis. Still, they managed. In fact, some orders were downright chatty in their silence. You'd be amazed how much gossip can be conveyed through eyebrow raises and poorly concealed smirks. Back inside, the bell chimes again. Another hour passed. Another prayer due. You imagine the rhythm of their lives built not around productivity apps or email, but the slow pulse of devotion. This hour for God. This one for brewing. This one for mending socks. You turn down a narrow hallway and pause beside a painted panel. It shows a monk standing beside a barrel. A big wooden spoon in his hand and a cat winding between his legs. The monk looks serene, almost smug, as if to say, yes, I do God's work, and I make a mean dunkel. Thank you very much. There's something oddly comforting about it all. Not just the silence, or the smell of rain and malt, but the intention. Every task, every sip, part of a pattern, a kind of holiness hidden in repetition. And here's the cheeky bit according to some versions of the rule. Beer wasn't just allowed, it was part of the daily ration. Some monasteries allocated each monk up to a gallon of ale a day, broken into smaller servings. Morning, midday, evening. Kind of like divine hydration with a mild buzz. Of course, not all beer was created equal. The breakfast ale, thin, light, almost porridge-like, was barely alcoholic. You'd have to drink quite a bit to feel anything other than full. And full they often were, especially on feast days, which came with extra servings. Lent might have been about sacrifice, but a dark, hearty ale was still fair game. Some abbeys even brewed different kinds of beer for different occasions. Small beer for everyday drinking, stronger stuff for guests, and the really fancy batches saved for bishops, visiting royalty, and let's be honest, probably the abbot's birthday. You make your way to the refectory, the dining hall, long wooden tables, benches worn smooth by years of quiet meals. No forks, this is medieval Europe, after all, but plenty of wooden spoons and clay cups, washed and reused for generations. On one end of the hall, a faded fresco shows Jesus at a table with 12 apostles. One of them may or may not be holding a tankard. It's hard to tell, but you like to imagine that even the Last Supper had room for a little ale. Outside, the rain picks up again, heavier now. It drums against the windows and hums through the corridors like a lullaby. One monk steps forward and lights a lantern. Its glow bounces gently against the walls. You pause and sit quietly at the end of the table. You imagine the clang of spoons, the silent nod of thanks, the soft gurgle of beer poured into a waiting cup. All of it still, steady, simple, nothing wasted, not even the silence. The bell tolls again. It's not loud, just a gentle, resonant echo sliding through the stone corridors like warm water down a cold bowl. You rise slowly from the refectory bench, your limbs loose, your thoughts trailing behind you like fog. The rhythm of monastic life has begun to seep into your bones, and right now, that rhythm is taking you back to the start of the day. Because while your modern mornings might begin with coffee and existential dread, a monk's day began with prayer, pitch darkness, and eventually a drink. Not coffee, of course. The word hadn't even been invented yet in their world. But beer, oh yes, the humble ale was very much in play. You step out into the cloister walk just as the rain lightens into a misty drizzle. It's the kind that clings to your robe and settles in your eyebrows, not unlike the condensation on a cool clay mug. The air smells faintly of rosemary and wet stone. You look around, and the abbey is beginning to stir, slowly, methodically. The first bell of the day sounds while it's still dark, the call to vigils, the earliest of the canonical hours. You don't leap out of bed so much as groan and shuffle, especially in winter. The dormitory is cold, and your robes don't offer much insulation. Still, you dress quickly and slip into line with the other sleepy figures, each one half praying, half swaying like a tired tree in the wind. There's no chatter, no good mornings, just the slap of sandals and the creak of ancient wood as the monks file into the chapel. Inside, candlelight flickers, incense curls like mist, and the chanting begins not lively, not joyful, but soothing, repetitive, deeply calming, a kind of vocal rocking chair. After prayers comes the first bit of labor. Depending on the day, you might be tending the garden, copying texts, gathering herbs, or if you're lucky assigned to the brewery, brewing, after all, was one of the more coveted tasks. Warm, fragrant, and blessedly indoors. But before all that, it's time to break your fast. And yes, this is where beer enters the story again. Monks typically consumed what was called small beer in the morning. Thin, low in alcohol, barely fermented, and slightly sweet from residual grains. It had enough calories to be considered food, which is especially helpful during fasting periods. This beer was often served lukewarm and in wooden mugs that may or may not have been cleaned regularly. But no one was here for sparkle or hops. They were here for sustenance. Historians still argue whether monks truly relied on beer for nourishment or if it was simply a convenient side effect. Either way, the routine stuck. By mid-morning, you've prayed, worked, prayed again, and now it's time for a second serving, perhaps a heartier brew if you're lucky, or if it's a feast day. You begin to sense a rhythm emerging: pray, work, drink, repeat. There's something almost musical about it, like verses in a hymn, one that smells faintly of bread and wild yeast. In the scriptorium, a young monk scratches ink across parchment. He pauses and takes a sip from a wooden cup beside him. Ink and ale, knowledge and nourishment. The balance feels strangely elegant. Outside, you see the brothers moving with purpose. The cook is stirring something in a large iron pot. The herbalist is fussing over a bundle of thyme, and the cellarer, Brother Anselm, again is rolling a barrel with the casual precision of someone who's done it 6 days a week for the last 20 years. And you follow a small group into the brewing house, a low building off to one side of the main abbey. Inside, it's comfortably dim. The air smells of wet grain and pine smoke. A fire crackles in the corner. Steam coils up from a bubbling vat. One monk stirs the mash slowly while another adjusts a funnel over a barrel. Their movements are deliberate, unhurried. Brewing, here, is not an act of urgency. It's a kind of devotion. Everything measured, every step considered. And there's a reason for that. Monastic beer wasn't just something to drink, it was something to live by. A monk's entire day was structured with this in mind. Meals, work, even the timing of prayers aligned with the brewing cycle. You didn't just drink beer, you lived in harmony with its process. Grain had to be soaked, dried, crushed, water heated, mash stirred, wort boiled. All of this had to be done quietly, respectfully. Sometimes while reciting psalms, it's the only kind of brewing where guilt and reverence ferment right alongside the yeast. You lean in and notice a small wooden sign hanging on a nail. It reads, "Bib sicut monachus," drink like a monk. Not a commandment, more a suggestion, a gentle one. You grin slightly. It's easy to romanticize this world, with its misty mornings and mild ales, but you remind yourself this was also a life of sacrifice, of cold floors and calloused hands. Still, the beer, it was a small comfort, a warm moment between endless hours of silent labor and soul-searching. And for that, monks took it seriously. They documented everything: grain weights, boiling times, fermentation temperatures. Long before the term craft beer meant beard oil and over-designed labels, monks were perfecting batch after batch under the careful eye of both God and Brother Anselm. You run your hand across one of the barrels. The wood is smooth and cool. If you listen closely, you can hear the faint fizzing of yeast at work, tiny bubbles rising in the quiet. Rain continues outside. A soft rhythm now, more like breath than weather. One monk ladles a sample from a smaller vessel and nods thoughtfully. It's ready. Not for a feast, not for a festival, just for another ordinary day. And that's the magic of it. In a life stripped of extravagance, a single sip of something warm and rich becomes an act of gratitude. You take your own sip in your mind. Let it linger. Let the barley settle. The bells will ring again soon. You stretch your legs quietly, trailing once more through the cloister as the day presses gently forward. Rain glistens on the flagstones now. Not heavy, not bothersome, just a hush falling steadily over the world outside. The kind of weather that makes you think of wool cloaks and damp manuscripts and steaming cups of something slightly sweet and gently spiced. Today, it's all about ingredients. Specifically, how monks got their hands on them. Because brewing wasn't as simple as tossing a few hops into a bucket and waiting for magic. No. Medieval monastic beer began long before the boil. It began with barley fields, malt houses, herb gardens, and the occasional wagon loaded with foreign spice. You follow Brother Anselm again. Of course, it's him down a narrow path that leads out of the main abbey and toward the grange. This is where the grain is stored. And oh, what a smell: warm dust, dry straw, old wood, and that familiar hint of grain that's almost like toast, but earthier. You duck inside a low building where monks are sorting through piles of barley. Some of it's plump and golden, some smaller, some rejected entirely. They don't waste it. Rejected grain might go to the pigs, or to less fussy batches of beer meant for guests who aren't great at tasting notes. You might assume monasteries were self-sufficient, and often they were. Many grew their own barley and hops, but depending on the location, climate, and scale of the operation, they sometimes had to trade or import certain ingredients. Malt was usually made on-site, soaking, sprouting, drying the grain, but some specialized monasteries would sell malt to others, the monastic supply chain, if you will. And then there were the spices. See, before hops became the go-to preservative and flavoring agent, monks relied on something called gruit, a mixture of herbs and spices, and sometimes bark or roots. Each monastery had its own blend, often guarded like a divine secret. Mugwort, yarrow, sweet gale, juniper, heather. These weren't just for taste. Many were medicinal, meant to help digestion, calm nerves, or prevent, let's say, excessive cheer. You imagine Brother Anselm weighing out dried herbs with all the seriousness of a pharmacist, pausing occasionally to sniff something questionable. There's a story, unverified, but delightfully persistent, about one monastery that added crushed oyster shells to their brew for minerality. Bold move. Very bold. Historians still argue whether monks chose these additives for flavor, health, or tradition. The answer is probably yes to all three. Brewing wasn't an exact science back then, but it was meticulous. Every step had purpose, and most of the time, the monks trusted what had worked for centuries. You walk now through the herb garden, where rows of plants grow in quiet, well-labeled harmony. Rain beads on sage leaves, on thyme, on something that smells like licorice, but might also be the start of a mild hallucination if improperly brewed. A sleepy bee lumbers past you and vanishes into a lavender bush. Everything here feels useful. Even beautiful things have jobs. In one corner, a patch of hops climbs up a trellis. Their cones are pale, papery, fragrant. Monks didn't adopt hops right away too bitter, too aggressive, but over time, hops won them over. They helped preserve the beer, gave it bite, and added a crispness that gruit couldn't quite match. By the 12th and 13th centuries, hoppy beers began to spread, first in Germany and then outward. And monks, well, monks were often early adopters, especially if it meant fewer batches going sour in the cellar. You pause to rest on a mossy bench, the scent of wet mint drifting up as you sit. Your cloak, imaginary though it is slightly damp, a small price to pay for this immersive moment. There's something wonderful about knowing the beer you might sip later began right here in the soil. Monks didn't just brew beer, they grew it, harvested it, dried it, measured it, blessed it, and tasted it at every stage. One monk nearby hums softly as he gathers bundles of thyme and tarragon. He moves slowly, carefully, as though each leaf matters, and to him, it probably does. You follow him back to the brew house, where the herbs will be dried above a low fire, then crushed and added in careful quantities to the boiling wort. No measuring cups here, just hands, memory, and quiet faith. Some of the rarer ingredients came through trade: cinnamon, cloves, even cardamom in very rare cases. These were saved for special occasions, feast days, visits from nobility, or perhaps when the prior was in a particularly generous mood. Monks didn't use spices to show off, at least not officially. But if a rival abbey's ale started turning heads, let's just say some monastic egos were not entirely immune, you chuckle to yourself, imagining two abbots passive-aggressively complimenting each other's brews at a synod gathering. Ah yes, a fine vintage. Brother Lucius, very earthy, perhaps a touch too much wormwood. But what do I know? Back in the grain room, another monk is loading a sack of barley onto a wooden cart. It's headed for the malt house now, where the grains will be soaked until they sprout, then dried over a wood fire. The sprouting is key. It activates enzymes that will later help convert starches into sugar during mashing. And sugar, as you may already know, is what the yeast throws a party on. The malt house is warm and smoky. You step inside and immediately feel it in your nose. Toasty, like roasted nuts and firewood. Monks rake the grains gently, preventing clumps, ensuring even drying. It's slow, physical work, but somehow peaceful. One of them smiles as you pass, soot streaked across his cheek. You get the sense he doesn't mind the labor. After all, each rake of the malt bed brings the monastery one step closer to a successful brew. And somewhere down the line, another monk will pour that brew into a mug, place it beside a pilgrim's bowl of stew, and offer it without fanfare. Just a gesture of welcome, of rest. You glance back once more at the rows of herbs, the stacked grain sacks, the line of barrels waiting patiently in the shadows. It's not glamorous, it's not efficient by modern standards, but it works. And as the rain picks up once more soft, rhythmic, persistent, you feel it again, the hum of life moving slowly, purposefully, through the abbey. A crow calls once from beyond the garden wall, then goes silent, as if realizing this isn't the kind of place for dramatic soundtracks. The rain answers with another wave of gentle percussion, tapping at the leaded windows like a polite guest. You're back near the brewery now, following the warmth and low murmurs of monks at work. The door creaks softly as you step inside. The brewing cellar is dim, the walls lined with thick beams blackened from decades of steam and smoke. The air is heavy sweet, damp, and tinged with something just a little sour. Not unpleasant, just alive. Barrels line one wall, big, banded, and rounded like sleepy giants. In the center, a copper kettle bubbles gently. A monk stirs it with a paddle taller than you, the motion so steady it could lull you under on its own. And in the corner, because some things never change, a cat stretches on a burlap sack, yawns, and promptly goes back to doing nothing at all. Welcome to the heart of monastic brewing. This space isn't grand or flashy. There are no glowing signs, no flight paddles or hipster coasters, just stone, steam, and the sound of careful work. You sit on a barrel, feeling its cool curve beneath you. From here, you can see the entire process play out in slow, deliberate stages. First, the mashing. That's the part where crushed malted grain is mixed with hot water in a big vat to create a porridge-like slurry called mash. This is when the starches in the grain begin to break down into sugars. And yes, this part smells exactly like wet cereal left too long on a warm windowsill, but in a good way. Monks would stir the mash slowly, reciting psalms under their breath or simply working in silence. Save for the occasional cough or clatter of a wooden ladle, they'd test the temperature with experience, not thermometers by touch, by instinct, and by sheer repetition. After all, you brew this beer week after week, decade after decade. You start to feel when it's ready. Historians still argue whether monastic brewers really understood the science behind all this. Probably not in the way we do now. But that didn't stop them from keeping meticulous notes, recipes, schedules, flavor adjustments, even weather conditions. One surviving brew record includes the line, "Cloudy this morning." Brother Thomas stepped on the cat again. Wort satisfactory. It's hard to beat that kind of holistic approach. Once the mash is complete, the sweet liquid now called wort is drained off and boiled. This part kills bacteria and prepares the mixture for fermentation. It also smells more pleasant than you'd expect, like a bakery having a tea party in a forest. At this stage, the monks would add their herbs, or later, hops. You watch as Brother Anselm, still unbothered by time or temperature, reaches into a basket and sprinkles something leafy into the bubbling pot. He stirs once, twice, and moves on. You catch the scent, earthy, bitter, floral. It's not overpowering, just enough to remind you that this drink, though born in barley, ends in something richer. Fermentation comes next. After boiling, the wort is cooled and transferred into large barrels or open-topped vessels. Then comes the addition of yeast, though, in medieval times. The monks might not have known exactly what that was. Instead, they reused the same barrels, the same paddles, the same fermenting cloths, which, conveniently, retained the wild yeast needed to kickstart fermentation. If a batch didn't bubble, they might chalk it up to bad luck, or a lapse in faith, or possibly a misaligned moon. Still, the beer came, bubbling, foaming, quietly transforming over days and nights. The monks would check it daily, sniffing, tasting, praying, and sometimes, if it turned out especially good, they'd take a quiet moment of satisfaction, maybe even a second sip. You walk between the barrels now, running your fingers along their surfaces. The air is cooler here, with a slight tang. You imagine the slow, invisible transformation happening inside yeast, munching on sugar, producing alcohol and tiny whispers of gas. One monk is jotting notes in a wax tablet, probably something like slightly more nutty than last batch. Prior still thinks it's too flat. There's a quiet joy in all this, a devotion not just to God, but to craft, to getting something just right, not for applause, but because that's what this life asks of you. Oh, and let's not forget the cat. He shifts slightly and eyes you with mild suspicion. Perhaps you're sitting on his favorite barrel. You apologize silently and shift a little to the left. He closes his eyes again. You've been forgiven. The ceiling creaks softly above as the rain taps on the roof. Time slows. Everything here moves with purpose, but never haste. And now, dear listener, hey, are you still with me? We've reached this point. Have you drifted off to sleep yet? If you're still awake, drop a comment to let me know where you're at and how you're feeling. But if you're already fast asleep, I wish you a deep, restful sleep filled with beautiful dreams. And if you're still here with me, we've only just scratched the surface. Back in the far corner, Brother Anselm uncorks a small barrel and fills a plain wooden mug. He takes a sip, tilts his head, and smiles. Not big, just a quiet moment of satisfaction. He nods once to the cat, who ignores him completely, and then heads off to deliver the brew to the kitchen for tonight's meal. You stand and stretch, your shoulders soft, your breath slow. Another day, another batch, another ritual, in a world that constantly rushes. It's oddly comforting to imagine a life where nothing is wasted. Not even the time it takes to stir something for an hour. Not even the silence between raindrops. You trail Brother Anselm out of the cellar, watching as he carefully cradles the wooden mug. Steps sure on the slick flagstones. Outside, the rain has softened again into something between mist and memory, just enough to blur the edges of the abbey walls, turning everything into watercolor. The air is cool, and you can smell fresh-cut herbs carried in by the breeze. Somewhere, a fire crackles, and somewhere else, a cow is deeply offended by the delay in her midday meal. Brother Anselm turns a corner, disappearing into the kitchen. You follow him just behind, quiet as a shadow, and find yourself in a warm, bustling space full of gentle clatter, low murmurs, and that comforting smell of onions, grain, and stewed vegetables that seems to exist in every medieval kitchen, no matter the continent. But the focus here isn't soup, it's the small vessel set beside the cutting board, the ale. Two monks sample it, not with the flair of sommeliers, but with the earnestness of men who are tasting both history and calories. One nods, the other smiles, just a little. No words are exchanged. The cup is refilled and set aside for the communal meal. And as the afternoon light slips further across the worn stones of the floor, you can't help but ask yourself the question, how? Exactly. Did the monks figure this all out? Because while brewing might seem like an age-old science now, back then it was more like divine luck. No one really understood microbes. Yeast was just a floating mystery. There were no thermometers, no sanitizers, and certainly no beer forums. Just centuries of careful trial and error, and maybe a few blessed accidents. Take fermentation, for example. You walk through the narrow door into a quieter room, the fermentation chamber. It's cooler here, and lined with barrels that are, quite literally, alive. Each one murmuring gently with the quiet bubbling of yeast feasting on sugars. Not that the monks called it yeast. To them, it was often the blessing, or the miracle of the foam. They didn't know about Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but they knew if a certain barrel always gave good results, you reused it. If a certain cloth produced foam, you kept it. There are records of monks carefully storing wooden paddles, rags, and stirring rods believed to carry the spirit of a good brew. Historians still argue whether monks understood this as rudimentary science or full-on divine intervention. Probably both. It's very medieval to say, God made the yeast, and we make the beer. Mostly. You lean in closer to one of the barrels. The surface glistens with fine bubbles. A tiny hiss escapes through the vent hole, just enough to remind you this process is quiet, constant, and absolutely alive. And perhaps, in some roundabout way, it made them feel more alive too. Because while monks were men of prayer and silence, they were also men of work, of touch, of sensory life. They grew the grain, touched the mash, tasted the foam, smelled the hops. Brewing was physical theology, earthy devotion. Brother Anselm enters behind you now, cradling a fresh bundle of dried herbs. Something bitter, something that will balance the sweet grain in the next batch. He glances at the barrels, checks a ledger, one marked only with tally marks and small notations like too warm or very good saved a jug. And then, quietly, reverently, he sets the herbs aside and begins preparing the next vessel. You're standing now in a process that began with ancient civilizations, Sumerians, Egyptians, even Chinese brewers with rice-based concoctions, and found its solemn, slightly tipsy stride here in a stone-walled abbey. A few curious medieval scholars recorded brewing practices, though much of it was oral, shared between monks during work, not written in books, which makes what you're seeing now something close to a living tradition, passed down in ladles and habits, in the quiet patience of fermentation. In a nearby corner, a small window lets in just enough light to cast golden stripes on the barrels. You pause to soak it in, and for a second, it's almost as if time forgets to keep going. The bubbles rise, the rain taps. You breathe in. There's a peace here that's hard to fake. Brewing wasn't a distraction from monastic life, it was part of it. A sacrament of labor, a daily reminder that God might not speak in thunderclaps, but perhaps in warm wort and a good head of foam. You remember hearing that some monks believed the perfect batch came not from ingredients, but from intention. That if brewed with humility, patience, and prayer, the beer would reflect its maker's soul. You glance again at Brother Anselm. He stirs with the slow grace of someone completely unhurried. He's not waiting to be done. He's already where he needs to be. And it occurs to you, in a world so frenzied, so full of pings and posts and urgency, maybe this is the secret we've forgotten. To do one thing, slowly, with purpose. To brew without rush. To wait without complaint. To drink without excess. To live, maybe, the way yeast lives quietly, steadily, transforming what's sweet into something richer. The bell tolls again, soft, patient, like a lullaby you almost forgot you knew. You let the sound wash over you, not hurrying to respond, just listening, just being. Outside, the rain has begun again, like it always does. You emerge once more into the open cloister, that square of quiet grass and stone enclosed by arches that feel like they've seen it all and probably have. The rain has eased into something barely there, more a presence than a downpour. Every leaf seems to shimmer under a soft coat of water, and even the ivy climbing the walls looks like it's just taken a deep, calming breath. This next stop isn't the chapel or the library or even the garden. No, now it's time for something a bit heartier, a bit toastier. You're heading toward the dining hall, or as the monks call it, the refectory. You push open the wide wooden doors and step inside. It's dim, as always, not gloomy, just deliberately understated. Candles flicker here and there. Stone walls stretch long and high, and 2 rows of thick tables run the length of the room like solemn banquet invitations. But there's no feast, not in the loud, rowdy sense. Just bowls of stew, crusts of bread, and of course beer. It's not party beer, not your friend's home brew that tastes like regret and orange peels. This is the midday beer, carefully crafted to sit at the center of the monastic diet. Because when you only eat 2 or 3 times a day, and your meals are mostly vegetables, grains, and boiled roots, you want your drink to carry a little weight. And it does, literally and spiritually. You take a seat on the end of one long bench. No one speaks. That's part of the tradition. Meals are eaten in silence, or near silence, sometimes accompanied by the quiet reading of scripture from a lone monk standing at a lectern. You hear the soft shuffle of feet, the occasional cough, a spoon clinking against a wooden bowl, and somewhere, a mug is gently set on the table, beer served in silence. You sip at least in your imagination, and the flavor is subtle, earthy, slightly sweet from the malt, slightly bitter from the herbs. The alcohol content is low, intentionally so. It's not meant to impair. It's meant to nourish, to warm, to wash down the cabbage and lentils. Some days, they might receive a stronger brew, especially if it's a feast day or the abbot's feeling generous. But more often, it's the same small beer brewed fresh every few days, meant to be drunk quickly, consumed before it spoils. No storage, no hoarding, just what's needed. Historians still argue whether this beer was truly nutritious enough to replace solid meals during fasts, or whether that was just a happy excuse monks leaned on when Lent came around. What's agreed on, though, is that beer became a kind of liquid bread, packed with enough calories to sustain a laborer, monk, or sleepy guest between matins and vespers. You glance around the table. The monks eat without hurry. Each motion is quiet, deliberate. One hand on the spoon, the other resting gently beside the bowl. There's no rush, no competition for the best seat or the biggest portion. Just the act of eating as prayer. In fact, the silence allows you to notice everything. The warmth of the mug, the faint hiss of steam rising from the stew, the way the wood grain on the table has been worn smooth by centuries of elbows and folded hands. Every now and then, one monk glances upward, not to make eye contact, but perhaps to appreciate the painted ceiling, or to catch the flicker of candlelight dancing above. Or maybe he's simply letting his mind wander. Even monks daydream over a quiet beer. You can't help but feel cozy, grounded, like you've tapped into some ancient rhythm that never really stopped. Because in this room, nothing is wasted. Leftover crusts are fed to the pigs. Spent grain from brewing becomes compost. Water from cleaning barrels might nourish the herb garden. Even the silence has purpose. It turns each meal into a meditation. One of the monks finishes his beer. He sets the mug down gently, wipes the rim with the edge of his robe, and passes it back to a younger brother, who carries it to the scullery without a word. You follow the mug with your eyes, then glance down at your own. Empty, but satisfying. You rise quietly from the bench, following a few other monks as they slip back into the corridor. The meal is done, and so is the midday pause. Now comes the return to work, to prayer, to stillness. The beer has done its job not to delight or dazzle, but to sustain. You find yourself smiling. There's something oddly comforting about a life where even drinking beer is part of the sacred rhythm. Before you leave the refectory, you pause and glance back at the empty mugs lining the table. Each one just slightly different, carved and worn from years of use. No two the same, much like the monks themselves. And you remember something curious, a tiny fringe detail you once read in a dusty corner of a forgotten library. Some monasteries actually marked each monk's mug with a personal rune or notch, not for pride or ownership, but so that no one drank too little or too much. Fairness, even in fermentation. You head back into the cloister with that thought tucked away like a note in a pocket. The rain has all but stopped now, leaving the stones slick and shining like wet glass. Somewhere, a bell rings, not sharp, not demanding, just a gentle reminder that time still moves. You take one more deep breath. The air is thick with moss, malt, and the fading scent of stewed lentils. A strange trio, but not unpleasant. And for now, that's enough. The air is different in the afternoon, softer, heavier, like the day itself has slowed down to take a long, deep breath. You walk through the cloister again, your steps in quiet rhythm with the subtle drip of rain falling from stone arches. Somewhere behind you, the last of the dishes is being scrubbed with sand and sage water. The scent of barley and soap root lingers in the breeze. But now it's time for a paradox that only a monk could truly master: owning nothing, yet making something of real value. You follow Brother Anselm once more. He's a man of many talents, this time down a narrow staircase into a chamber filled with records, ledgers, and the not-so-subtle smell of aging parchment. This is the scriptorium's lesser-known cousin, the account room. A few candles flicker. Rain dots the leaded windows. You can hear it ticking against the panes as Anselm thumbs through a book filled not with psalms or parables, but with notes on grain weight, brewing yields, and beer distribution schedules. You've officially entered the world of monastic beer economics. Monasteries were, at their core, religious institutions, but they were also economic engines, especially in rural areas where monks were often the best educated and most organized people around. They ran farms, mills, bakeries, vineyards, and yes, breweries. So how does that square with the vow of poverty? Well, the vow of poverty was personal. Monks didn't own anything individually, not their robes, not their mugs, not even their pens. But the monastery as a whole could possess land, buildings, livestock, and yes, barrels of fine pale ale. You run your fingers along the spine of one dusty ledger. The ink is faded, but you can still make out the headings: barley from East Field, brewed for Feast of St. Bede, sent to Abbey of St. Alcuin, 12 casks, 1 cracked. It's delightfully mundane. No sermons, no revelations, just the sacred art of keeping track of beer. Some of this beer stayed within the monastery, for the monks themselves, but some of it was sold, or more precisely, traded. Barrels of ale were sent to nearby parishes, to travelers, to nobles in need of provisions. Sometimes it was exchanged for grain, candles, or parchment. Occasionally, for cold, hard coins, though that was often frowned upon. You didn't want your brewing to seem too profitable. But make no mistake, monastic beer was good business. So good, in fact, that some monasteries became locally famous for their brews. Word would spread often by pilgrims, traders, or monks visiting from other abbeys. Suddenly, your quiet little cloister is the talk of the county, all because your beer doesn't taste like week-old dishwater. You glance at another ledger. This one's more ornate. Tidy penmanship, margins filled with tiny decorative doodles, and in one entry, a careful drawing of a barrel with wings, a playful reminder that even beer has a way of taking off. It's tempting to imagine the monks being embarrassed by their success. After all, wasn't pride a sin? But maybe, just maybe, they felt a quiet satisfaction when a traveler took that first sip and sighed with relief. Or when a local lord sent back for a second cask with a polite note and a loaf of bread in return. Historians still argue whether monks exploited their brewing skills for gain, or if they simply used what they had to support their mission. Most likely, it was a balancing act, a bit of both. Brew with humility, distribute with care, and keep the books neat. Back in the cellar, you see a pile of empty barrels ready for transport. Each one has been sealed, marked with the abbey's crest, a subtle symbol. Just a carved line and star, barely noticeable, but it tells a story. It says this was made with intention. A few novice monks haul the barrels up to a waiting cart. It creaks under the weight, drawn by a donkey who seems deeply unimpressed by the importance of his cargo. You smile. Even in beer transport, the monastic life doesn't skip its ritual of quiet. Slow progress. You follow the cart outside the abbey gates, just far enough to feel the shift in the air. The world beyond is louder, less predictable. But here comes your favorite contrast, a humble monk in a patched robe handing off a barrel of beer to a noble steward in a velvet hat. They exchange bows. A small pouch changes hands, grain or coin. You're not sure. And just like that, the abbey's beer has entered the secular economy. You watch the cart disappear down a muddy road, rain still misting through the trees. And you think to yourself, this isn't selling out, it's staying afloat, feeding mouths, keeping fires burning, funding manuscripts, repairs, charity. And as for the monks, they go back inside. No fanfare, no cheers. Just another day, another batch, another quiet trade. Inside the cloister, the mood remains unchanged. A monk rings a bell for evening prayer. Another tends to the herb garden. And Brother Anselm, ledger in hand, jots one final note in the margins. Blessing received. Batch successful. You can't help but agree. You return to the inner cloister just as the sun begins to bow behind the gray cloud cover. Not that you see the sun directly. This is Northern Europe, after all. And in a monastery, sunshine is more of a rumor than a reality. But the quality of the light changes subtly. Everything turns bluer, softer. The rain lingers in the air like a forgotten hymn. And you're just in time for something special hospitality, because while monks may live simply, eat modestly, and brew in silence, they are also bound by one of the oldest, most quietly beautiful tenets of monastic life, welcoming the stranger. Hospitality isn't a side project in the monastery. It's a sacred duty. And for weary pilgrims stumbling in with aching feet, dripping cloaks, and blistered faith, the best welcome of all was often a warm bowl of something thick and steaming, and a mug of monastic ale. You walk past the guest house entrance, a heavy wooden door set in a modest arch. No grand signs, just a small carving of a palm extended in welcome. Inside, it's warm, dim, and smells like dried lavender, smoke, and freshly baked rye bread. And standing near the hearth is Brother Milo, the guest master. He doesn't smile much, but his eyes are kind. He's already laying out a small tray: bread, cheese, a ladle of stew, and yes, a mug. Not large, not fancy, but filled with the latest batch from Brother Anselm's cellar, slightly darker than usual, a hint of herbs on the nose. The pilgrim it's meant for arrives moments later. Mud-caked boots, travel-worn face, a look that says he hasn't spoken to anyone but himself for 2 days. He removes his hat respectfully. Bows. Says nothing. He doesn't need to. The food and the ale do the talking. Hospitality was one of the few times monks were allowed to bend the rules. Guests didn't have to follow the same strict hours. They could eat more, talk more, even laugh a little. It was understood that the world outside was hard enough. Inside these walls, mercy took precedence over formality. You watch as the pilgrim sips the ale. He closes his eyes, just for a second, maybe longer. And in that pause is the entire point. The relief, the warmth, the almost spiritual experience of feeling safe and seen. The ale was never meant to dazzle. It wasn't brewed for prestige. It was brewed for moments like this, and it was often free, or offered in exchange for prayer, a story, or a humble thank you. Some monasteries had limits, 1 cup, 2 cups, but few turned people away. And in times of plague, war, or famine, monks were often the last line of kindness when every inn had locked its doors. Historians still debate how much of this was genuine altruism and how much was subtle outreach after all. A guest today might be a patron tomorrow, but the result was the same rest, bread, and beer for the body and soul. You peek into the guest hall rows of modest beds, fresh rushes on the floor, and bundles of rosemary and chamomile hung above the door. The atmosphere is more comfortable than luxurious, the kind of space that asks nothing of you but rest. Brother Milo returns to the kitchen to prepare another tray. You follow him, noting how everything flows like water, no rushing, no barking orders, just practiced kindness. He pauses briefly to taste the next batch of ale. He frowns, adds a pinch of something from a pouch at his belt, probably yarrow or licorice root. He stirs, sips again, nods once. Ready. You drift toward the rear courtyard where delivery barrels are stacked, waiting to be rolled to the guest house cellar. Some marked with a red thread around the bunghole, meaning stronger ale, meant for those who need extra comfort. Or, possibly, the visiting bishop. Both categories have been known to snore impressively. A cat weaves between your legs again. You're beginning to think this one just follows the scent of malt. Back in the guest house, the pilgrim has fallen asleep, the mug still warm beside him. Brother Milo drapes a thick wool blanket over his shoulders. No words, just quiet, efficient compassion. This isn't charity, this is ritual care. You settle onto a bench nearby, feeling the hum of the fire, the hush of the rain, the subtle comfort of a world where giving someone a warm meal and a cup of beer is considered holy work. It's the kind of hospitality that asks nothing in return. And maybe that's the part we've lost. The idea that a stranger at your door might just need bread and quiet, that a good ale, brewed with patience and care, can be as healing as a sermon. And for the monks, this is simply what they do. No applause, no testimonials. Just another visitor, another night, another quietly poured pint. The fire crackles, rain slides gently down the shutters, and across the room, the mug glows faintly in the firelight, half full, half forgotten, but entirely sacred. The rain picks up again as night begins to settle over the monastery. It's not dramatic, not a storm, not a downpour, just that same gentle percussion that's been playing all day. A rhythm now, like breath, or footsteps on wet earth. You stand under the arch of the cloister walk, watching the courtyard disappear into mist, and you feel that deep, quiet stillness settle into your bones. But there's a curious tension in the air tonight. Not a bad one. Just a murmur of pride, a whisper of competition, because word has spread again that the monks at this abbey may be brewing too well. You follow Brother Anselm once more, this time not to the cellar, not to the scriptorium, but toward a narrow gate that leads beyond the monastic walls, just outside. A small crowd has gathered travelers, townspeople, a few suspiciously well-dressed merchants pretending to be humble pilgrims. They're all here for one thing. The beer, you see. Monastic ale had a reputation over time, as word traveled along trade routes and through parish halls. Some monasteries, especially the ones with a few too many clever brothers, began producing beer that rivaled and then outpaced anything brewed in town. Some townsfolk didn't mind. After all, it was still beer. But local innkeepers and guild brewers, oh, they minded. Deeply. And so, tension started to bubble, not unlike a poorly racked batch of porter. You walk now through the small outer yard, where empty barrels once rolled freely into waiting carts. But now, you notice something strange. A guard. Just one. Quiet, but present. Monks didn't usually keep guards. But when your ale is good enough to outshine the local taverns, precautions become necessary. Historians still argue whether the monks intentionally disrupted the local economy or were just really good at brewing in peace. The truth, most likely, lies somewhere between a clever abbot and a few too many compliments from traveling bishops. In some towns, it came to actual confrontation. Documents survive of abbots being summoned to local councils to defend their right to sell beer. Others had to negotiate brewing limits, agreeing to only sell certain batches to pilgrims or in exchange for goods, not coin. But here, in this abbey, Brother Anselm plays it cool. You follow him through the brewery once more, watching as he checks the tap on a barrel marked with a blue seal indicating it's the stronger ale. Not for monks, not even for guests. This is the good stuff, saved for special use. You lean in. It smells like toasted bread and dried fruit with a hint of something floral, almost smug. Anselm pours a sample into a clay mug and hands it to Brother Milo, who sniffs it like a monk who's seen some things. He nods. It's good. Too good. Maybe. But what can you do? Outside, the townspeople murmur with increasing impatience. A few even try the door. It stays closed. You imagine the monks inside, standing around barrels like proud parents at a school concert, silently wondering if they should dial it back or double down. Eventually, the steward arrives. He's the one responsible for distributing the ale. A younger monk, quick on his feet and quicker with plausible deniability. He hands off a single cask, makes a polite bow, and retreats before any questions can be asked. You turn to leave, and pass by a wall lined with old brewing tools, wooden paddles, carved molds, even a ladle polished smooth from 1,000 stirrings, each one a relic of quiet excellence. It's easy to see how this happened. The monks didn't mean to steal the spotlight. They just brewed with care, day after day, season after season, using the best ingredients they could grow, swap, or bless. And people noticed, even today, you can still trace the lineage of famous beers back to monasteries, Trappist ales, Belgian doubles. Even some German lagers have roots in monastic brewing. What began as necessity became craft. What was once humble nourishment turned into revered tradition. But of course, monks were human. And when someone from the town accused them of showing off, they'd probably smile softly, pour a mug, and say something like, "We brew as God wills," then proceed to win the local fair's beer competition. Again, you pass through the gate now, back inside the cloister walls, and the noise of the outside world fades like a lantern set gently in snow. Inside, the monks have resumed their rhythm: prayer, work, silence, and the occasional chuckle when no one's looking. Even the best brewers in town can't match what's made slowly, in quiet devotion, by hands that are rough from work and soft from grace. And now, hey, you still with me? We've made it halfway through tonight's journey. Have you drifted off to sleep yet? If you're still listening, Drop a comment and tell me what part of the world you're listening from right now. Or just let me know how you're feeling. And if you're already snoring away, well, may your dreams be peaceful and filled with little wooden mugs clinking under candlelight. Back in the brewery, Brother Anselm leans against the wall and exhales. His work is never done. But tonight, the beer is good. Too good. Probably. He won't say anything. He'll just add another quiet note to the brewing ledger visitors gathered. No complaints. One donkey chewed on the delivery rope. And so, the balance between devotion and demand continues. A pint at a time. The night deepens. The rain has taken a break, just for a while. You hear only the faint hiss of wet leaves settling and the occasional creak of old wood adjusting to the cool night air. Inside the monastery, everything moves more slowly now. Candles are lit, cloaks are hung. The world narrows to footsteps and flickering light. You slip into the refectory again. It's not mealtime, but the space is never truly empty. A few monks linger tidying, preparing for tomorrow, or simply passing through on their way to evening prayer. The room feels different now. Gone is the clatter of spoons and the scent of lentils. What remains is the unmistakable presence of quiet routine. And tucked into this routine is one of the more curious rituals, silent sipping. You make your way to the far table. There, a few mugs rest upside down on a linen cloth. Each one dried carefully by hand, never hurried. Monks didn't just drink beer, they drank it with deliberate restraint. During meals, talking was either forbidden or strictly limited. If anything needed to be communicated, it was done through a combination of prearranged hand signs and eyebrow choreography. Imagine trying to mime. Can you pass the mustard using only your index finger and a vague look of hope? And yet, they managed. Some orders had up to 24 different signs just for eating and drinking. There was a sign for beer, of course, usually involving a gesture like tipping an invisible mug toward the mouth. Universal, timeless. You picture the scene, long wooden tables, monks seated in rows, each one lifting his mug, sipping slowly, eyes on the table or closed in quiet reflection. Somewhere, a lector reads from Scripture. Somewhere else, a draft sneaks through the cracks in the wall. But no one speaks. Not a word. Historians still discuss the reasons for this enforced silence. Was it about focus, humility, digestive tranquility? Possibly all of the above. But it also served a more practical purpose, keeping the monastery from turning into a medieval frat house every time beer was served. Let's be honest, give any group of tired, overworked men a few pints and permission to talk, and things might spiral. So the rule of Saint Benedict, ever wise, steered the monks gently toward moderation and mindfulness. You run your fingers along the grain of the table. Smooth, worn. You imagine the generations of monks who have sat here before you, their hands resting in prayer, in work, or wrapped around a mug of slightly warm, faintly herbal ale. The beer wasn't strong. It wasn't meant to be. But it carried a kind of comfort, a gentle reminder that even in a life of fasting and sacrifice, there could be moments of warmth. And yes, there were accidents. A monk spilling his mug and trying desperately not to shout. A novice mistaking the lector's pause for a prayer cue and standing up too early. Or the infamous moment when Brother Hildebrand let out a particularly enthusiastic post-sip sigh and was given dish duty for a week. But these were exceptions. Most of the time, meals unfolded like choreography. Sip, spoon, silence. A ballet of barley and bread. You glance toward the head table. where the prior or abbot would have sat. His beer likely poured by another monk. His portion perhaps slightly larger on feast days, but still nothing extravagant. The hierarchy of the monastery didn't stretch much into the mug. What mattered wasn't who got the best brew. What mattered was that everyone received their share, in equal measure, at the proper time. Just enough to soothe, never enough to stumble. You stand now, wandering toward the small side chamber where mugs were washed. A few remain drying upside down on pegs clay. Mostly. Some wooden. Each one marked faintly on the bottom with a number or symbol. A way to track, to rotate, to care for things without claiming ownership. One mug has a tiny chip near the lip. It's been smoothed over time, like a worry stone. You wonder who used it. Maybe Brother Anselm. Maybe a guest who once wept into their bread and found peace in the silence. Because for all its simplicity, this act drinking in silence was strangely powerful. In a world that shouted, the monastery whispered. In a world that rushed, the monks lingered. Even the beer seemed to pause mid-sip, asking permission to proceed. There's something profoundly restful about that. You sit once more, mug in hand, imagined, but somehow real. The rain hasn't returned yet, but you can hear it gathering its thoughts. The wind shifts outside the high window. The flame of the nearest candle dips, then rises again. You sip slowly. The taste is familiar now. Earthy, slightly bitter, with a warmth that settles deep in your chest. Not flashy, not loud, just good. And you realize, perhaps for the first time, that in this world, this cloistered, barley-scented world, pleasure isn't forbidden. It's simply refined, restrained, poured carefully, sipped quietly, and shared in the stillness between prayers. And when the mug is empty, you don't rush to refill it. You simply place it down, right side up this time, letting the silence fill the space where the ale once was. A pause, a breath, a kind of invisible benediction. Outside, the first drops of rain begin again. The rain has returned, not loudly, not to announce anything, just a soft insistence tapping the roof of the monastery, like fingers drumming a slow lullaby. It's the perfect backdrop for what you're about to witness next, not the brewing itself, or the drinking, but the ritual woven into every part of the process. You're back in the brewery, now quiet and still for the evening. The fire in the hearth has gone low. Steam no longer rises from the mash tun. The tools have been washed and stacked with near spiritual neatness. And yet, this moment isn't empty. Not at all. This is where you start to notice the blessings, because beer here isn't just made, it's consecrated. Every step, from grain to glass, is tucked gently into the folds of monastic prayer and ritual. Brewing is labor, yes, but it is also very much liturgy. Brother Anselm enters quietly, robes whispering as he moves. He heads straight to a small wooden shelf tucked into the corner, one you hadn't noticed before. Upon it sits a candle, a book of psalms, and a small cross carved from oak. He lights the candle, opens the book, and begins to recite, not loudly, not theatrically, just a soft, steady murmur, like water over stones. The prayer is for the next batch. The grains haven't even been milled yet. The water hasn't boiled. But already, the act of brewing is being wrapped in intention. You sit near the barrel racks, letting the sound of the words and the gentle patter of rain merge in your mind. The prayer isn't fancy, no flowery language, just a humble request that the work of these hands may nourish bodies and souls, that the ale may bring comfort, not indulgence, that the batch not explode again like last Easter. Okay, that last one's unsaid but implied. Historians still argue whether monks believed their prayers affected the beer itself, or simply blessed the act of making it. Was it about spiritual power or discipline of the heart? Either way, the ritual stuck. Some abbeys even assigned a specific monk, a brew monk, whose sole duty was to maintain not just the recipe, but the spiritual cleanliness of the process. You imagine a novice monk being scolded not for dropping a spoon, but for forgetting the pre-boil psalm. Priorities. And it wasn't just the brewing that was blessed. The barrels were sprinkled with holy water. The fermentation room was sometimes sensed like a chapel. Even the hops were occasionally laid out in front of an icon before being added. Was this superstition, tradition, an expression of joy? Yes, all of the above. Monastic life was built on routine. Yes, but also on reverence. If God was present in everything, then certainly he was present in the ale, in the stirring, in the patient waiting. You look over to see another monk, Brother Luke. You think carving a new stopper for one of the casks. He hums as he works. The melody is slow and circular, like a lullaby wrapped in Latin. He dips the finished plug in wax, then signs it quietly with a tiny cross scratched into the grain. No one will see it once it's in place, but that's not the point. These rituals weren't performed to impress. They were meant to anchor the monks in their purpose. When life was uncertain, when the weather failed the crops, when illness swept the countryside, this one-act brewing remained steady, slow, filled with steps and prayers and hope. You cross the room toward a tall cabinet that's barely cracked open. Inside, you glimpse scrolls rolled tight and tied with faded twine. Recipes, most likely. Or maybe just prayer schedules for brewing days. You lift one gently. The parchment crackles. The ink has faded, but you can still read the notes. Stir thrice. Rest twice. Add lavender if the wind is from the west. You blink. Lavender. Apparently, this batch had ambitions. Beside that, another note. In a firmer hand, bless the wort at dawn. Best when sung in low voice. There's something unshakably charming about monks adding a musical recommendation for fermentation. But it fits. The whole process is a kind of hymn. Boil. Cool. Ferment. Wait. Taste. Share. Back across the room, Brother Anselm has finished his prayer. He snuffs the candle with 2 fingers, murmurs something under his breath, and turns back toward the barrels. His face is unreadable, but calm. This is a man who's brewed for decades, and who has no doubt whispered the same blessings more times than he's sipped the result. You wonder what kind of day he's had. Did a batch go wrong? Did a cask crack? Did a novice accidentally mistake vinegar for ale? Possibly, but you wouldn't know it, because here, in this space, things are done not for the outcome, but for the act. You sit again. The rain continues. This kind of brewing doesn't ask for applause. It doesn't chase awards. It simply says, this is what we do, and we do it with care, even now, centuries later. When breweries run on computers and fermentation tanks look like alien spacecraft, some of that spirit remains. In a carefully pulled pint, in a well-worn recipe, in the knowledge that someone, somewhere, once stirred a pot and whispered a blessing not to sell, not to boast, but to share something quietly good. The candle on the shelf still glows faintly, its scent mingling with that of drying grain and damp wood. You close your eyes, and just for a moment, you imagine that all labor could feel like this, anchored, rhythmic, holy. The storm passes in the smallest of ways. No thunder, no drama. Just a long sigh of wind followed by the gentle hush of rain becoming mist. Outside, the leaves tremble with leftover droplets. Inside the monastery, the walls breathe that clean, earthy scent that follows a good soak-wet stone, wood smoke, and something faintly spicy. And as you step back into the brewery's annex, your nose wrinkles with curiosity, because something smells different. There's still malt in the air, sure. Still the damp wood of barrels and the last of the dried steam. But today, there's also a floral tang, an herbal kick. And wait, is that chamomile? Welcome to the wonderfully odd world of early flavoring agents, when monastic beer was less about bitterness and bubbles, and more about whatever happened to be growing nearby. Before hops became the standard, monks had an entire garden of options for flavoring and preserving their ales. This mix, called gruit, was an herbal concoction that could be as simple as yarrow and rosemary, or as experimental as brace yourself henbane and bog myrtle. Yes, henbane, also known as a mild hallucinogen. Let's just say not all monk brews encouraged piety. Some encouraged very colorful dreams. Historians still argue whether the use of these herbs was entirely culinary, or partly medicinal, or perhaps even liturgical. After all, many of these plants were believed to have spiritual properties. Some calmed the stomach, others soothed nerves. A few, we suspect, made evening prayers a bit more entertaining. You peer over Brother Luke's shoulder as he crushes dried petals into a bowl lavender and sage, with a pinch of wormwood for bitterness. His movements are slow, precise. He sniffs, adjusts, grinds again. No recipe in sight. Just memory and intuition. And maybe a quiet prayer that this batch won't turn out like the one that smelled like socks. It's a real legend, that one. A poorly balanced gruit mix brewed by a novice who mistook dried mugwort for marjoram. The result was deeply educational. The barrels were discreetly repurposed for livestock hydration. You make your way toward the brewing cauldron, where Brother Anselm is watching the wort with the same focus most people reserve for open-heart surgery. The fire underneath crackles gently, and the copper glows in the low light. One by one, herbs are added, not tossed in like salt to pasta water, but lowered ceremonially, stirred gently, released like something sacred. There's rosemary, sharp and piney, sweet gale, which smells oddly like green tea, then a whisper of meadowsweet, believed to reduce inflammation and, for reasons no one's entirely clear on, make people feel more polite. The smell changes with every addition. No two batches are ever the same. That was both the magic and the problem with pre-hop brewing flavor depended on the mood of the garden, the weather, and whoever happened to be holding the spoon. Eventually, some abbeys kept dedicated gruit records, trying to control the chaos. Others embraced the unpredictability. Brother Milo, for instance, was known to say, if God wished every pint to taste the same, he would have made barley bloom in straight rows. You pass by the old gruit chest, tucked beneath a shelf of worn ledgers. It smells like the inside of an apothecary's robe, mysterious, dusty, faintly medicinal. Bundles of thyme, sprigs of mugwort, a small bottle of what might be nettle syrup, probably labeled, "Do not use." Again, there's even a note pinned to the lid, warning strong flavors. Brother Petrus found the last batch too invigorating and cleaned the cloister twice. You stifle a smile. Of course, not all monks were flavor anarchists. Some preferred the rise of hops, which slowly began to replace gruit as a more stable, more preservative-friendly option. Hops gave the beer a reliable bitterness, helped it last longer, and most importantly, didn't give you lavender burps. But that transition took centuries. And in the meantime, monks kept experimenting, balancing tradition and taste in each wooden cup. You settle on a stool beside the herb table and breathe deeply. The scent is soothing, like a sleepy meadow in a teacup. There's something enchanting about the idea that these plants, once gathered under gray skies and blessed at dawn, now live again in boiling wort, transforming, releasing, dissolving. The monks didn't just brew with what was available, they listened to what the earth gave them. If rosemary grew better that year, the beer leaned piney. If sage flourished, the flavor was warm and grounding. Brewing was less a science and more a seasonal conversation. And sometimes, things got weird. One record mentions a red beer brewed with beets and raspberry leaves for a visiting archbishop. Another tells of an ale with ash bark, brewed to inspire clarity during long readings. The side effects were not recorded, possibly because the reader forgot them halfway through. You glance at the cauldron again. The boil is nearly done. Brother Anselm stirs once more and lifts the ladle to taste. He closes his eyes, nods. A small adjustment, a pinch more yarrow. He doesn't speak. He just smiles barely and returns to his work. You imagine tasting this ale wild, unpredictable, perhaps not entirely pleasant, but alive, like the land, like the monks themselves, a reminder that even in silence, in rules, in schedules, there's always room for a little botanical rebellion. The door creaks slightly. The wind has returned, bringing with it the faint scent of damp mint from the herb garden. Somewhere outside, a bell rings, not for prayer, just the hour passing unhurried, unimpressed, and in your hands, if only for a moment. You imagine holding a mug of ale so strange and perfect, it could only have been brewed by men who gave their lives to God and their spare afternoons to flavor experiments that walked a fine line between genius and herbal disaster. The candle flickers, the rain returns, and somewhere in the shadows, a cat sneezes, perhaps protesting the juniper. The brewery is quiet again, its recent herbal chaos now distilled into the lingering scent of dried yarrow and something vaguely citrusy. The fire beneath the kettle has burned down to a bed of glowing coals, and Brother Anselm has gone to the chapel for evening prayers. The room, though still, hums with the memory of movement, of boiling, of stirring, of small and sacred acts. But tonight, something else stirs a faint draft near the shelves, a flicker of candlelight against a loose stone in the wall. You wander closer and notice something odd. A set of scuff marks on the floor, a dusty bottle out of place, a wooden plank just slightly more worn than its neighbors. Now, you wouldn't say the monks were dishonest. They took vows. After all of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But even the most pious of souls can have secrets. You give the plank a little nudge. It shifts. Beneath it, a small cavity dry, lined with straw, and just big enough for, yes, a few clay bottles, carefully stoppered. No labels, no notes, just the faint scent of something a bit stronger than your average refectory brew. Welcome to the whispered tradition of rogue monk beer, because while most monastic brewing was above board, measured, blessed, and recorded, there were always a few curious brothers who couldn't help but experiment outside the rules. And sometimes, those experiments required a little discretion. You sit cross-legged by the hidden stash and pull one of the bottles closer. The cork is sealed with wax. Someone cared about this batch. You imagine a monk, let's call him Brother Tiberius, hovering near the cellar one evening, ducking out after prayers with a small satchel of exotic spices tucked beneath his robe. Perhaps he'd bartered for them with a traveling merchant, offering a few jars of honey in return for a pinch of cinnamon and a twist of orange peel. Forbidden, not technically, but definitely frowned upon. Brother Tiberius would wait until the others were asleep, or at least pretending to be, and sneak into the brewery to craft a personal brew. Just a bottle or two. For study, of course. Possibly for science. Mostly for curiosity. Historians still debate the extent to which these secret brews flourished. Some records suggest certain monasteries tolerated them as a kind of creative outlet, while others banned them outright. There are even accounts of disciplinary notes written in the margins of brewing logs. Brother Paulus has again added nutmeg to the evening ale. Discipline issued. It was surprisingly pleasant. You pull back from the stash and replace the plank carefully. Secrets are meant to be discovered. Yes, but also respected. You wander back into the main chamber and glance around the brewing tools. Everything neat, everything stored. But you notice a few items that stand out. A wooden ladle carved with an intricate vine pattern. A spoon that's been polished far more than use would explain. A mug tucked behind a beam, painted illegally, if we're being strict with a tiny, grinning son. Brother Milo passes by, pauses, sees the mug, and gently moves it forward. No comment, just the faintest trace of a smirk before he continues down the hall. The monks weren't saints. Well, okay, some of them became saints. But before that, they were men clever, restless, creative, and occasionally bored enough to ferment apple skins in candle stubs just to see what would happen. Some monasteries became quietly famous not just for their official brews, but for the rumors of unofficial ones. Visitors would ask, delicately, whether any special reserves might be available for the right kind of donation. The monks, of course, always declined. Politely. But if you were a friend of the abbey, and if your intentions were pure, and if your coin was just old enough, well, you never knew. Back in the refectory, you spot a monk reading by candlelight, a thick book in one hand, a mug in the other. He sips, pauses, looks surprised. He glances around, no one's watching. He takes another sip, then mutters something under his breath in Latin. Possibly a prayer. Possibly. What in the name of Saint Bede is that? You wonder if he stumbled on a leftover experimental bottle. Maybe one flavored with mint and pear. Or, heaven help us, onion. There are no records of an onion ale. But you suspect someone, somewhere, tried it. Once. The quiet rebellion of secret brewing wasn't about breaking rules. It was about pushing boundaries inside a world of limits. About asking what might happen if just once the wort was boiled longer, or if a pinch of cinnamon could soften a sharp barley batch, or if, perhaps, God wouldn't mind just a dash of honey. You step back into the corridor and head toward the sleeping quarters. The lamps are low, the floors are swept, but somewhere down the hall, a monk coughs twice, like a signal. A door creaks, And then nothing. You smile. The truth is, for all its discipline, monastic life allowed room for quiet invention, for whispered traditions passed between generations, for hollowed-out books that didn't contain psalms, but recipes. There's even a tale, probably apocryphal, of a monk who hid a personal brew so well it wasn't discovered until decades after his death. The bottle was perfectly sealed. The beer, when opened, was reportedly shockingly good. They named it after him and included his likeness in a stained glass window. So next time you raise a glass, imagine Brother Tiberius, bent over his hidden cauldron, humming a quiet hymn as he stirs his off-the-record creation. You make your way through the dim cloister hall, where the candlelight is softer now, diffused through old glass and the drifting fingers of mist that slip in through the high windows. The walls glow amber. The flagstones beneath your feet feel warmer. Somehow, either from the fire's slow endurance or from the sheer comfort of familiarity, you've walked these halls many times tonight, and each time they offer something different. A distant bell chimes, not loudly, almost like it's testing the air. You follow the sound. This time, your path curves past the old garden, around the chapter house, and toward a small chapel door you've yet to open. The hinges groan as you step inside, and there, candlelit and still, is a single wooden bench, a stone altar, and 3 small bottles sitting reverently on a cloth-covered shelf. You take a seat. You don't speak, because tonight you've earned a pause. And hey, if you're still with me right now, this is your little checkpoint. Are you still awake? Still listening? Or maybe, just maybe, you've already drifted off. If you're still awake, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love knowing which corners of the world are settling into sleep with me. But if your eyes are heavy and your breath has slowed, then let go. Let yourself sink into the story, like a ladle into a warm barrel of ale. If you dream of quiet monks and soft rain, then we've done our job well. And now, let's continue. You lean closer to the bottles on the shelf. They're old, very old, but not dusty. No, these are cared for, revered, even. The labels are hand-painted, faded gold leaf, careful script. One reads Arnoldus. You smile, because now we're going to hear a legend, the tale of Saint Arnold of Soissons, the patron saint of hop pickers, brewers, and those who believe in the holy power of a well-crafted pint. Arnold was a monk in the 11th century, later an abbot, even a bishop. He was known for his piety, his wisdom, and his, how shall we say, strong opinions about safe drinking habits. See, in those days, water was, well, risky. Boiling wasn't common practice yet, and even the clearest stream could harbor unpleasant surprises. But beer was boiled. Beer was fermented. Beer was, in Arnold's view, miraculous. So when disease swept through the towns around his abbey, Arnold didn't just offer prayers, he offered beer. There's one version of the legend where, during an outbreak of plague, Arnold instructed the people to avoid water and drink ale instead. The result? Those who drank the blessed brew remained untouched by illness. Coincidence, perhaps, or maybe, just maybe. Faith met fermentation, and they shared a quiet handshake. There's another story equally dreamy of Arnold's death, when his body was brought back to the abbey for burial. The monks stopped at a small village. The townspeople were so inspired by his legacy that they offered barrels of beer to all present. And upon tasting it, the monks declared, "This is the best ale we have ever known." A miracle, a marketing triumph. Historians still argue. Of course they do. But what remains is the tradition. Saint Arnold, the holy brewer, depicted in paintings holding a mashing rake instead of a crozier, his robes flecked with hops, his eyes eternally patient. You reach out and lift the small bottle bearing his name. It's cool to the touch, perfectly sealed, and you imagine just for a moment what it might taste like. Rich, earthy, perhaps with a whisper of cloves, or maybe nothing like that at all. Maybe it's just the thought of it that lingers. You set the bottle back down gently. Monks often told stories like Arnold's not just to honor the past, but to make brewing feel sacred. Not just a task, not just a job, but a legacy, a sacrament in its own right. And in some ways, it was every drop crafted with care, every recipe tested by time, every pint poured with a blend of humility, generosity, and maybe just a drop of holy mischief. You sit in silence, the soft crackle of candles your only companion. The rain has paused. The walls exhale. Somewhere down the hall, a door opens and closes, slow and distant. You imagine the monks kneeling in the chapel, praying not just for grace, but for balance in the boil, for a smooth fermentation, for just the right bitterness to land on the tongue and then drift away. Because isn't that what life is? In the end, a careful brew, a blend of bitter and sweet, a quiet wait in the dark before something rises, transforms, and becomes miraculously something nourishing. You lean back, the bottle on the shelf gleams faintly, and the story continues. You leave the quiet chapel behind, stepping once more into the cloister where the air smells like damp stone and midnight thoughts. There's a hush that clings to the arches, now a deeper silence, the kind that only settles after hours of stillness. Most of the abbey is asleep, or at least, pretending convincingly. You follow the worn corridor toward the scriptorium, expecting quills and scrolls, maybe a stray monk hunched over a half-finished copy of a hymn. But what you find, instead, is something entirely more practical. A long table, neatly arranged scrolls, ink pots pushed aside, and, in the center, a stack of brew logs. Of course, because for all the prayers, for all the reverence, monks were meticulous. And beer dear, sacred beer required records. Brewing was holy work, yes, but it was also data-driven. You sit at the table and unroll one of the scrolls. It's smooth with age, the script tight and efficient. You half expect it to be full of Latin invocations, but instead, you see rainy, boil reduced by 1 hour, hops lighter, Prior's feedback acceptable, but lacks depth. You stifle a laugh. Lacks depth. The monks really were the first beer snobs. The logs are grouped by date, by weather, by feast day. Not just recipes, but full brewing conditions. Everything mattered. Humidity, wind direction. Whether Brother Simon had a cold, he always exaggerated. Even the position of the sun at first mash. One entry reads, mash uneven, suspect barrel leak, cat again in herb sack, resolve before Lent. Historians marvel at these logs not just for their detail, but for their consistency. The monks brewed on a cycle, often weekly, sometimes even daily in larger monasteries. And each time, they recorded their results, their errors, their improvements. You flip to a new scroll, this one older, more faded, the script shakier, but no less orderly. Experiment with gruit blend, sage plus angelica root, unpopular with guests. One traveler claimed visions. A just formula. Of course they wrote that down. And of course they tried it again, just with less Angelica. You run your fingers across the margins. Tiny notes are scribbled there, half prayers, half commentary. Saint Arnold. Bless the yeast. Let this one not turn sour like Brother Peter's attitude. One corner is smudged perhaps from a wet thumb or a mug set down too hastily. And then, curiously, a short poem. The grain is sweet, the boil is long, the wind is sharp, the mash is strong. We stir and wait, we wait and pray, for ale to come in holy way. You smile. Even in record keeping, the monks left room for poetry. Brother Anselm enters behind you, holding a fresh candle. He doesn't speak, but nods toward the scroll in your hand. He recognizes it, probably wrote half of it. He sets the candle down, unwraps a small bundle of parchment, and begins updating a more recent entry. Ink scratches quietly across the page. Batch 432. Good clarity. Slight herbal bloom. Stored in south cellar. He pauses, considers something, then adds, sipped by prior. Response. Mellow. Felt like a hymn. Monastic brewing, you begin to realize, was part science, part sacrament, part journalism. Every brew was a chapter, every cup a footnote, and the brew logs, a living story of the abbey itself. You glance across the table and see the weather log. Yes, they kept one of those too, not just for crops, but for beer, rainfall levels, wind speed, temperature at sunrise. A note from a particularly hot summer reads, beer fermented too fast, taste impatient. Even nature, it seems, had a role in shaping the flavor, and it wasn't all technical. Some entries recorded guest reactions, too. Notes like Pilgrim from Burgundy, 3 mugs, weeping, claimed beer tasted like youth, or merchant requested recipe, politely declined, gave him a turnip instead. Not everyone understood the value of a good brew, but the monks did. As you rise, you catch sight of a bound ledger at the far end of the table. This one is newer. No scrolls, no frayed edges. A proper book. You open it to the middle and find something remarkable, a hand-drawn chart, tracking batches against prayer schedules. The idea, apparently, was to see if certain prayers had a noticeable effect on flavor or fermentation. The verdict. Tuesdays yield brighter ales. Coincidence, perhaps. Try Gregorian chant next week. You gently close the book, feeling a strange warmth in your chest. Because what you've stumbled upon here isn't just administration. It's care, attention, a deep and enduring respect for the process, for the transformation, for the mystery that lives between grain and foam. The logs weren't kept to impress. They were kept so the monks could get better. Not richer, not more famous, just better. And if that isn't the purest form of devotion, what is? You glance once more at Brother Anselm, still writing. He doesn't look up. He doesn't need to. His entire body is part of the rhythm now. Ink, candlelight, prayer. And you step back into the hallway, your thoughts bubbling like a quiet ferment, a blend of fact and wonder. Behind you, the logs remain, waiting for the next batch, the next note, the next day in a long, humble line of sacred brews. You leave the warmth of the record room behind, and the door closes with a soft thud that settles into the corridor like the last period on a long sentence. The night is cooler now, the air crisper, tinged with that damp, leafy scent that comes when the world's been rinsed clean by hours of steady rain. You follow the faint shuffle of footsteps back toward the brewery, not to the main room, but to a smaller chamber off to the side, one you haven't explored yet. It's dark inside, but the scent is unmistakable grain, ink, and time. Here is where the monks kept their tools. Yes, but also their records of ingredients, sacks of barley, jars of honey, dried herbs, even crushed berries in ceramic pots. Each item meticulously labeled in Latin, and sometimes with little drawings helpful for novices who hadn't yet memorized the difference between sweet Gale and the thing that gave Brother Hugo hiccups for 2 days. But what you've come for is the brewing debate. Not the theological kind, the botanical one, because nestled into the shelves, stacked beside barrels and tucked between prayer books and parchments, are brewing guides with titles like On the Virtues of Gruit in the Monastic Tradition and Concerning the Bitter Flower, A Consideration of Humulus Lupulus. Yes, tonight you're stepping into the great historical flavor feud gruit versus hops, long before hops became the backbone of modern beer. Monks used gruit, a wild, herbal blend that gave each brew a different character depending on season, soil, and mood. Mugwort, yarrow, heather, horehound, even spruce tips. If it grew, they tried it. If it didn't kill anyone, they kept it. Gruit gave beer sweetness, warmth, sometimes a little spice, but it didn't preserve well. It couldn't stop sourness from creeping in like gossip through the cloister, and that's where hops came in. Hops, those strange, papery flowers, offered more than bitterness. They gave beer shelf life, structure, a kind of crisp discipline. And by the 11th century, some monks began noticing that hopped beer stayed fresh longer, traveled better, and depending on who you asked, tasted cleaner. And so began the quiet tug-of-war. You find a scroll open on the work table. It's ink, just dry. Brother Mathieu prefers hops, claims it reminds him of clarity. Brother Gerwald calls them the devil's parsley. You imagine them arguing over a tankard, both sipping the same brew, both convinced the other has no taste whatsoever, neither of them raising their voice. Of course, that would be unseemly, but perhaps a few more coughs than necessary. Historians still argue whether the switch to hops was driven by practicality or politics. After all, hops began to be taxed and regulated by local lords, while gruit was often controlled by church authorities. Brewing with one meant paying the crown, the other, the clergy, and the monks stuck in the middle, just trying to make something that didn't turn into vinegar overnight. You notice a small, hand-drawn chart on the table, 2 columns, gruit and hops. Underneath each are notes, tallies, and a rating system that includes smiley faces. Some things never change. A tiny drawing near the bottom shows a monk asleep beside a barrel, a cat perched on his stomach. Caption: too much of both. You glance at a glass jar filled with dried hop cones, pale green, fragile, smelling of lemon peel and pine resin. You rub one between your fingers. The scent is strong, but not unpleasant. Clean, bright, a little brash. Next to it, a pouch of crushed gruit herbs, darker, moodier. The scent is earthy, mossy, like the inside of a damp library. Both are inviting in their own way. Both have stories to tell. You realize then that this wasn't a battle of right versus wrong. It was a conversation, a centuries-long discussion on what beer should be bold or soft, bitter or sweet, stable or adventurous. And the monks, they didn't choose one over the other right away. Many blended, Some brewed batches both ways. There are records of abbeys maintaining parallel brews, a gruit beer for feast days, a hopped ale for guests, a mixed batch for the cellar. One very honest note reads, "The guests did not notice the change. Brother Tiberius pretended they did." It was never just about flavor. It was about identity. Gruit was old, local, tied to nature and season. Hops were new, uniform, easier to scale. Choosing one meant shaping your monastery's place in the wider world of brewing. And maybe, you think, it's not so different from any other tradition. What do we keep? What do we change? What do we preserve because it tastes like memory? You turn to leave, but pause beside one last scroll rolled up neatly and tied with a leather thong. You unfurl it carefully. The ink is more recent. A title scrawled across the top. To whom it may concern. Both are lovely. Brew what you love. Below it, no name, just a small drawing of a mash paddle and a heart. You smile. Some debates never end. But if monks taught us anything, it's that even disagreements can be brewed with patience. The rain has returned. Light. Soothing. It taps the roof like fingers on parchment. You feel the floor cool under your feet. The herbs hum quietly on the shelf. The hops sigh in their jar. And somewhere, Brother Mathieu and Brother Gerwald are still arguing. Silently, with raised eyebrows and second helpings. The rain deepens. Not louder, just thicker. More deliberate. It falls in wide, slanted strokes now, like a blanket being drawn over the monastery. The air is dense with mist and memory. You can hear the occasional tap of droplets falling into stone basins, the quiet rustle of cloaks as monks prepare for bed. But your path tonight isn't headed to the dormitory just yet. You step into a long corridor lined with tall arched windows, most fogged over now. At the far end is a door you haven't noticed before broad, blackened by time, reinforced with iron. You push it open slowly, and your breath catches at what lies beyond. A large room, cold, dry, still, and filled with silence and dust and the echoes of voices long gone. This is where the barrels no longer bubble, where the brewing tools have been hung on pegs and not touched in years. The silent side of monastic brewing, the afterword. Because like all stories, this one too began to fade. The early golden age of monastic beer, when barrels rolled out like blessings and recipes were tucked under pillows, did not last forever. The world outside the monastery changed, and like it or not, it knocked gently, then not so gently, at the cloister gates. You walk slowly between the old barrels. Some collapsed, some still whole. Cobwebs glint in the candlelight. Labels have faded to soft blurs. One still reads, Feast of Saint Dunstan, 1489. You touch the wood. It's cool, hollow, but it hums faintly with the ghost of spice and malt. You're walking through a history that outlived itself. Monasteries were not immune to politics, to war, to kings and reformers with ideas about land, power, and the ownership of barrels. By the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, monastic brewing began to decline. In some places, it was slow and sad, a matter of dwindling vocations, aging monks, and recipes lost when a cellarer died without a protege. In others, it was sudden and sharp. The Reformation swept across Europe like wildfire, and with it came closures, confiscations, and the dissolution of monasteries. In England, Henry VIII's reforms led to the shuttering of hundreds of abbeys. Beer barrels were smashed, tools sold or melted down, and sacred brewing ledgers were used for kindling or worse, accounting. Historians still argue whether the suppression of monastic brewing was a side effect or a target. Did the reformers resent the wealth that some monasteries had quietly built through beer? Or was it just too tempting to seize those well-stocked cellars? You kneel beside one of the remaining barrels. It's been opened long ago, empty now. But inside, a faint ring of residue, darker than the rest. A reminder, a line of sediment that says something lived here once. And some monasteries held on, especially on the continent Belgium, Germany, parts of France where monastic brewing not only survived, but eventually evolved. Some abbeys, especially Trappist ones, would later rebuild their breweries and continue the craft with reverent precision. But here, in this quiet room, you're standing in a place that never came back. The monks still live here, still pray, still grow herbs and tend their flocks. But the brewery is smaller now. Fewer barrels, less demand, no export, just the quiet tradition. A few mugs at mealtime, a batch for the feast day, enough to sustain, not enough to sell. You find a bench and sit. There's something achingly tender about this room. It's not sad, not exactly, just still, like the pause after a hymn ends, before the last echo disappears into the rafters. On the far wall, someone has painted a small icon, a mash paddle crossed with a sheaf of barley. Beneath it, a simple phrase, laborare est orare. To work is to pray. You wonder if anyone comes in here now. Maybe Brother Anselm, when he's feeling nostalgic. Maybe one of the novices, sneaking in to sit among the relics and wonder what it was like to brew for an abbey at its peak. You reach up and gently lift an old stirring paddle from its peg. The handle is smooth, polished by decades of hands, the end chipped where it once scraped the bottom of a boiling vat. It's heavy, real, and you imagine it in motion again, swirling, lifting, guiding the grains through that sacred transformation. Outside, the wind sighs through the cracked window. You watch the candle flicker. You listen to the silence. It's tempting to think the story ends here, in this dusty room of resting tools. But it doesn't, because monks still brew, not everywhere, not as before, but in quiet corners of the world. The tradition persists, adapted, preserved, resurrected. Trappist monasteries still produce beer under strict rules, limited quantities, with profits supporting their communities and charities. The tools are stainless steel now, the recipes more refined. But the heartbeat, the purpose, still the same, to make something nourishing, something honest, something holy, in its own quiet way. You set the paddle back in place, and as you rise to leave, you realize sometimes a tradition doesn't need to be loud, or profitable, or popular. Sometimes it just needs to be remembered. The corridor outside the old brew room seems warmer by contrast, like stepping from a cellar into candlelight. You feel the stone beneath your feet shift from cold resolve to something gentler, something inviting. The night is far along now, hours past compline. The rain has slowed again, just a faint hush in the gutters, like the abbey itself is whispering good night. But even this late, a few monks remain at work. You find yourself following the faint sound of humming a low, tuneless melody drifting from a side room. You push the door open gently and are greeted by a scene at once humble and extraordinary. Brother Anselm, again. By now, you'd recognize his silhouette anywhere. He stands at a broad workbench, lit by a single lantern. Around him, small glass bottles, scraps of parchment, bits of twine. But what catches your attention is what's on the table. A stack of papers, neatly pinned, inventory sheets, yield reports, brewing notes. The future of the Abbey's brewing, not just its past. Because while many monasteries let their brewing fade quietly into memory, a few like this one have chosen to carry the tradition forward. Not for profit, not for prestige, but because they believe the rhythm of brewing is still part of their purpose. Brother Anselm hums as he writes batch 644. Stronger barley flavor, slight citrus in finish, no guest complaints. You smile. That's about as glowing a review as you'll find in any monastic record. And here, beside the modern notes, you see new tools, clean barrels, carefully labeled, a hand-carved mash paddle, clearly made by someone with pride in their work, even a small digital thermometer humble, tucked away, almost embarrassed to be here. You're witnessing the quiet persistence of tradition. The monastery doesn't ship its beer across oceans. There's no sleek website, no branded merchandise. But once or twice a year, local villagers visit the gatehouse, where a monk passes through a few dozen bottles modestly labeled, always brown glass, always sealed with wax. They sell only enough to keep the abbey running, to repair walls, to feed guests, to buy candles and ink and dried fruit for feast days. But the brewing lives on. Historians still argue whether these modern monastic breweries are truly descended from their medieval ancestors. The recipes have changed. The techniques have advanced. The herb garden is no longer the primary pharmacy, but the spirit, the ritual, that has never left. You watch as Brother Anselm rises, stretches his back, and begins cleaning up. Every motion slow, steady, reverent. A cloth wiped over the table, a bottle set gently on a shelf. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. And then he reaches into a small drawer and removes a wooden stamp worn smooth with use, carved with a simple barley stalk and the monastery's initials. He dips it into ink and presses it onto the corner of the newest brewing page. The final touch, a quiet seal of authenticity. Not to say, look at what we've made, but simply, this was made with care. You sit down across the room, letting the stillness settle in again. You think back on the journey, the barley, the boiling, the bubbling, the rules, the rituals, the rogue monks sneaking spice jars past curfew, and you realize that brewing was never just about the beer. It was about presence, about staying rooted in the moment, about doing something slowly, with intention, about serving others. Even if all you had to offer was a clay mug and a wordless nod, you glance at the shelf beside you. A small booklet rests there, its cover etched with delicate lines. You open it and find a modern version of the brewing prayer. It reads, "Bless these hands that stir, this grain that gives, this flame that warms, this silence that speaks. Let the ale nourish the body, and the pause between sips nourish the soul." You close the booklet gently, behind you. Brother Anselm finishes his work and snuffs the lantern. You both walk toward the cloister now, steps echoing softly. Outside, the sky is barely starting to pale, not quite dawn, but no longer full night. And there's something reassuring about that things end, but they don't disappear, like yeast that rests at the bottom of a cask, waiting to rise again, like prayers whispered in the steam of an early boil, like beer that tastes of barley, of effort, of memory, and of monks who brewed not to be remembered, but simply because it needed to be done. The sky outside is shifting just barely. Not sunrise, Not yet. But there's a faint thinning of the darkness, a gentling of the night's long hush. In the cloister, mist curls softly around the arches, like breath held too long. Rain has stopped, and the silence it leaves behind feels vast, deep, like the inside of a great cathedral. You step through the side garden, dew brushing against your ankles. A few birds stir in the hedgerows, not quite singing, just testing their throats. It's a sleepy, sacred hour, and you're returning to the beginning. The brewery is still empty now, but not lifeless. The barrels are clean, the tools stored, the hearth is cool, and in the corner, a single mug sits on the windowsill, catching the faint light from a sliver of moon. You walk to it slowly and lift it. There's no ale inside, just the scent of grain and wood and warmth remembered. This is where the journey ends, not with a bang, not even with a sip, but with a kind of still reverence, because at the heart of monastic brewing was never the beer itself. Not really. It was the pause, the quiet between stirring, the breath before the boil, the soft step of a monk at dawn, walking the same path he walked the day before. It was in the waiting, the watching, the trusting. The monastic brewery wasn't a business. It was a rhythm, a pulse of prayer and patience. You sit now, once more, on the worn bench beside the main vat. Your fingers rest on the rim. You can almost feel the memory of steam, hear the scrape of the paddle, smell the sweet beginning of the mash. The monks who brewed here are mostly gone. Some moved on. Some grew old. Some were buried under stones worn blank by time. But their work remains not in bottles or barrels, but in the echo of intention, in the shadow of a recipe passed quietly from one set of hands to another. And the brewery, it's quieter now, smaller, but it still breathes. They still brew here, a few times a year, just enough to remember, just enough to serve, just enough to offer a pilgrim something warm on a rainy evening, with no sermon, no show, just a mug passed from one hand to another, and a soft smile that says, "You are welcome." And now, dear listener, if you're still awake, look where we've come. From grain in the field to foam in a cup, from cellars to chapels, from ancient rules to rogue recipes tucked behind a bookshelf. We've walked in the slow rhythm of lives lived with care. We've stirred with quiet hands, waited with patience, and tasted the deep comfort of things made not for praise, but for peace. If your eyes are closed, let them rest. If your thoughts wander, let them drift. You've heard the story now. You've walked the halls, watched the brew, stood beside the fire. And now it's time to rest. But before you go, just one last sip. You take the mug to your lips. There's nothing inside. But still, the warmth lingers. Still, the quiet fills your chest like breath. And outside, just beyond the cloister walls, the sky grows one shade lighter. It's morning, almost, but for now, let it wait. Let everything slow now. Let your shoulders sink just a little deeper into the bed. Let the sounds around you, whether rain or silence or soft music, fade into the background, like a candle dimming at the end of a long evening. You've spent this night in the company of monks who asked for little and gave much. Men who woke before the sun, who stirred pots not for praise, but for sustenance, who brewed ale not to be remembered, but to serve to warm others, to nourish the body, to steady the soul. Their world was one of patience, of quiet labor, of rhythm and breath, and maybe, just maybe, you've carried a little of that stillness with you now. Picture yourself in that stone-walled brewery, beside the soft light of a morning candle. The tools are clean, the fire is low, and outside, the garden glistens with dew. There's nothing urgent here, nothing rushed, just the gentle hum of another day arriving. Breathe in once, slowly. Hold it for a moment. Let it go. If you're still awake, you've come a long way. And if you've already drifted off, that's just fine too. Either way, the story has done its work. And tomorrow, let it come slowly. No rush, no noise. Just the quiet comfort of knowing that somewhere, in a monastery still warmed by centuries of devotion, a monk stirs a pot with care and everything begins again.